Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Hopefully, some of you have had time for your lunch by now, and uh, welcome, welcome to my session. Sorry, it's a little bit strange to be virtual. Haven't been virtual for a while, um, but I wanted to talk to you today a little bit about some of the things that I've been seeing in the market and some of the trends in Web3, particularly focused on interoperability, which is, as you know, the headline of the slide. And also on the subject of interoperability, I will also be joined by some of my friends and colleagues from the industry on a panel, I believe in about an hour or so, from the Open Metaverse Alliance, also to talk about interoperability. So I urge you to catch us then as well. But without further ado, maybe I'll explain a little bit first who I am and a little bit about Animoca Brands. For those of you who don't know, we are a game company. So we, began our sort of journey to Web3 as a mobile game developer about a dozen years ago, and now. We've been in Web3 focused on games and entertainment for the last 6 years. And we make games of all different styles, whether they're casual mobile games or console AAA style games. And everything is done in Web3. And we also have a very, very active investment sort of practice. So we're one of the most active investors in Web3, and we have about 450 portfolio companies and invest across everything from infrastructure to all forms of content, gaming being the biggest piece of that. So without further ado, I want to talk a little bit about, as the last presenter mentioned, generative AI. And I bring this up because generative AI obviously is a big topic of conversation at the moment. But I think the most important impact that it has on our business is really from day one that generative art emerged as a construct, in the mainstream, I guess about a year ago with Stable Diffusion and such. We started experimenting with using it internally to create art. I think apart from the fear mongering of AI coming and taking all our jobs, etc., I think it's very useful as a tool in the business of game production. So artwork is one of the most labor-intensive and time-consuming parts, and therefore cost-intensive parts for making games, particularly because the free-to-play model relies on a constant stream of new content being developed. And so as you develop that new content, then you need to have artwork with everything. So you're constantly making artwork, and if you're doing photorealistic 3D work, it's even more expensive and time-consuming. And so that's why I think it's interesting to see what people are doing in certain areas of generative AI and how they're pushing the envelope. So as I mentioned, we started with thinking about 2D artwork and graphics to put in our games, which we can, experiment through using generative AI. But more than that, we have the opportunity with experiences like this one, which is from called Skybox AI, and it's from Blockade Labs. And what Skybox AI does is it allows you to basically use a simple text prompt to generate an entire 3D 360-degree simulation. And we think that this is an amazing visualization tool because when you think about how games are created, you have to imagine a complete universe, right? And this is just in the head of the game designers and the art directors. And now they have a way to think, okay, so what would this game look like as a, futuristic, futuristic hellscape? And they can just type in a text prompt and see what that looks like. So I think it's quite interesting. And here's an example, perhaps, that I will show you of how Skybox AI works. And we have a bit of a video, which hopefully we can get started here. Perfect. So here you see basically just putting in the text prompt, and then from a simple text prompt, you can generate not just a 3D image, but a very detailed 360-degree, tilt and pan kind of landscape. And this is incredibly useful. It's literally as fast as you see on the screen, that you can generate this and you can tweak them. And if you think about storyboarding in the old days, we used to storyboard literally drawing out cell by cell animation. And so now that we have this, um, now that we have this ability to do it with AI landscapes, then it gives us so much more flexibility, essentially, in how we think about visualizing stuff. Now, the next example I want to talk about is Rosebud. And with Rosebud, what they do is they think about not just the visualization of how a game is made, but actually how they can bridge the gap between simple text prompts and actually making games. And so what we have with Rosebud is the idea of using AI to actually generate code and compile code and make a game. And so what we have here is an example of how we can use Rosebud's technology in order to create a simple game and tweak the game and change its attributes. And so if we can play the video, there we go. So what you see now is the idea of creating a simple Flappy Bird game. And this is literally from, a natural language text prompt. But we can think about how this can then be modified, right? You want to customize what this game looks like. You want to customize the experience. And all of this can be done by continuing to refine your text prompts. And I think this points to a future where game development will actually be, opened and broadened to a huge audience of non-technical game developers who just have great ideas of how they can create games. So for us, this is very, very exciting because it means that in the future, business of game development will be much broader, and content will, there's going to be so much more content available that will draw in consumers to play lots of different kinds of games. And obviously, this is the Metaverse Summit, so it goes without saying that, from our perspective, games are mini-metaverses, and the idea of how they interoperate with each other, utilizing Web3 as the foundation, is really what gives rise to the metaverse. And so now I'd like to give you an example of how games, I think, are blurring the boundaries into being much more real. And here's a great example. What this is essentially a piece of tech which allows you to give voice and give rise to NPCs. And NPCs are non-playable characters in games. And this example, just in case people recognize it, is from the Matrix game, which is a console game. But the idea is that these NPCs, these non-playable characters, have always been part of the background. And because they're in the background, they never really had any, they were very basic. They walk around on an endless loop. If they have discussions or dialogue, it repeats over and over again because they're essentially part of the landscape or the furniture, if you will. But thanks to the ability to use generative AI, like ChatGPT, for example, you can now give voices to these characters that have unique conversations, and you can interact with them on a street corner, for example, like in this case, and they will react to specific stimuli so that you can both observe them on the street, or you could go and interact with them yourself. And what this does is this changes the experience. So this changes the experience from being primarily about you, the user, to a really interactive, realistic simulation where you could just kind of watch everybody and watch the world go by and let it entertain you, not dissimilar to watching reality television. And so I think that's really exciting because, again, it starts to really blur the lines between what we consider reality and what we consider a simulation. And I think this has huge ramifications as we start to build out metaverse experiences, because the metaverse is a big place, and to be able to populate it with these kinds of really hyper realistic NPCs, realistic not just in their video rendering, but realistic in the way they move and what they talk about and how they interact with you, it'll allow us to have a much more engaging place, and and a much more engaging experience. Um, you know, even in an environment where there may not be a lot of players online at a particular time, because the NPCs can fill in the blanks there. So the next trend I'd like to talk about, and this is very, very relevant as we think about building out metaverses in Web3. One of the big challenges for adoption has been onboarding of users on the one hand, and also content creation for developers. And so one thing I've really observed as a trend over this past year is there are a lot of companies that are emerging as kind of one-stop shop SaaS providers for blockchain tech stacks. Because if you really want to have metaverse interoperability, you need to have Web3 Rails, and they're not straightforward for traditional game developers or content developers to put in place. You need to have blockchain engineers, smart contract developers, tokenomics. And so in this case, it allows companies to integrate various APIs or SDKs that include all of the Web3 Rails inside, whether it's wallets or it's custody solutions, etc. And I think this is really going to help onboard a lot of the development community from Web 2 into Web 3 now that they have these tool sets available. So I think this is a trend to keep an eye out on. And if you are a developer, definitely seek out some of these companies because they can really ease your journey into Web 3. I think the other thing that's interesting as a trend is, as we look around us, seeing all of the very seasoned game developers from AAA studios now starting to participate in Web3. Most notably teams like CCP Games, the makers of EVE Online, one of, if not the most successful MMO of all time. And they're creating EVE Frontier based on the lore and the universe of EVE Online. Excuse me. The team at Life Beyond, which is one of our studios, who came from working on games like Assassin's Creed, and another one would be NFL Rivals, which is from Mythical, and that team, a lot of them came from EA and worked on games like Madden NFL, and Summoner's War, which is of course the flagship title at Com2uS, and one of the most successful games on mobile, and the new version, Summoner's War Chronicles, uses the XPLA blockchain, which was created and pioneered by Com2uS. So quite exciting developments, I think, from some of the notable Web 2 game studios coming out in Web 3 at the moment. So to talk about interoperability, and this is going to be a real theme, I think, of some of the discussion today. In the sandbox in Alpha Season 3, which took place this spring, one of the big things that for us that was a theme was this idea of interoperability. And why did we think this was important? Because it's about uniting disparate communities across Web3 in a shared metaverse experience. And so what we did was we reached out and to lots of different Web3 communities by creating utility for their specific projects. So what you see here are a bunch of different projects that are largely PFP projects or profile pic projects, where individual holders have unique NFTs that are 2D images. and we translated those 2D images into 3D voxelized characters in the art style of the sandbox. And I think the idea behind this was, how do we connect with those communities and make their NFTs interoperate with the sandbox in a fun way that will, please and delight them, but at the same time onboard them to Sandbox so that they come and check out the experience at Sandbox and see that they're welcome to bring their IP to Sandbox, and they get the red carpet rolled out for them. And so what you see here are the avatars that we created for them. If you have any one of these collections, you can just put your NFT in your wallet and come to Sandbox, and you will have a voxelized version waiting for you. And I think this is a really important tool as we build out metaverses, in thinking about how we can cooperate amongst the different metaverses, because I think a very important concept to building the metaverse, capital T, capital M, is that really the metaverse is the aggregate of lots of little metaverses, right? Lots of experiences, whether we call them games or otherwise, and the sandbox is an example of one of them. And so to create the metaverse, we need to figure out how to interoperate all of the various smaller metaverses. I think of it like, the world, and the sandbox is a city in the world, but you've got lots of cities and countries, and you need to interconnect all of them in order for people to move from one to the other. So we still need to create our airplanes and our railways and our roads to provide that interconnection. So this is one way that we did that, and it's a relatively technically straightforward and simple way to do that through an avatar system. Another example would be doing it through specific IP that has been tokenized. So this is a game called Rec League, which we launched a couple of weeks ago. It's a PvP fighting game. These are mechs that fight, and you can build your mechs. And the idea was to leverage an existing Web3 IP, because these IPs are based on open and composable assets, so that we worked with Yuga Labs to use the other side IP. You can see in the background of the picture, it's evocative of the other side itself, the scene. But we created these mech robots that essentially have Bored Apes inside them. That's the idea here. And so if you come as a Bored Ape Yacht Club PFP holder, you can come to Rec League, and you are eligible to mint robots and parts, etc., for fighting in matches. And so you get very specific and special treatment as a Bored Ape PFP holder, and that's how we, onboard you into the game and give you kind of a VIP lane, if you will. Alongside that, of course, we have the rest of the Web3 community who's welcome to play, and onboarding mechanisms for Web2 players, because we want the game to be open and playable for everybody. But we want to highlight the interoperability features with the Bored Ape PFPs to allow us to cater to those customers, especially because we based the IP universe around the Bored Ape Yacht Club and other side IP. So I think this is another great example, and a more recent or very recent example of interoperability, as it's just launched in the last 2 weeks. Another example here is our Rev ecosystem. So we have a fungible token called the Rev token, and this provides functionality within our various motorsports and motoring related games. So we work with Formula E, and we work with MotoGP. We have a game called Torque Drift, which is all about drifting. We have Rev Racing, and we have more products on the way. And all of these accept the Rev token for payment and as a reward system, so that we can allow players who love motorsports not just to have to focus on one siloed experience, but to be able to carry their rewards and their fandom from place to place. So this is step one, is unifying these games with a shared token infrastructure. And then step two, which we have not completed yet, is to then make the content tokenized content itself. So those NFT cars and bikes, interchangeable amongst different games. And so that's actually a much bigger challenge, one that we've been working on for a while, and working on creating standards of interoperability specifically for cars. And we will be deploying that in the near future as well. So the last thing I'd like to touch on is, in the time that we have together is regulation. And so with regards to regulation, the SEC in the US made a lot of headlines when they filed suits against Binance and Coinbase earlier this year. I think it has had somewhat of a chilling effect on Web3 companies operating in the US and Web3 investors in the US. The investors have started looking outside of the US at investment opportunities, and I think this is, unfortunate for the US as a country when it comes to making progress in Web3. But we do see some silver linings, so that those lawsuits were immediately followed by a judgment in the SEC's case against Ripple Labs, which provided, I think, some legal foundation for actually establishing some guidelines as to what are and are not considered securities and what types of offerings and tokenizations would fall under securities regulation and what would not. So I think we are getting there, but it's been slow going, particularly in the US. However, outside the US, it's another story. The regulatory climate in Asia is really, I'd say, much more welcoming, frankly, because Asia's really been embracing Web3. And this is fabulous because the Monetary Authority of Singapore and the Japanese regulators, et cetera, have all put in much more straightforward regulation towards Web3, which is great. But particularly as we are a Hong Kong headquarters company, I'd like to focus on China, because China, I think, as we know, is one of the biggest markets in the world for anything. But particularly it's interesting in how they've chosen to place a regulatory sandbox in Hong Kong and focus most of their energies on how they're going to deal with crypto and Web3 generally on Hong Kong. And we've seen the outcome of that, in recent regulatory actions in Hong Kong. There's a full Web3 task force, which, Yat, our chairman, is on, focused on just figuring out how Hong Kong is going to embrace and make the most of not just Web3 technology, but welcome Web3 companies and developers and support the burgeoning ecosystem. And I think we've seen a lot of that in terms of them providing a retail trading framework. They've essentially green-lighted baskets of tokens for retail trading in Hong Kong. They're working on creating a Hong Kong dollar stable coin. And so I think following on a lot of the success that we've seen at Token 2049 in the last couple of weeks, I think people are on quite a high as to what's going on in Asia generally. And I think Hong Kong is a real bright spot in terms of that. So, I would urge everybody to consider spending some time both in Asia and Western markets, but get an idea of where these Web3 and metaverse communities are most active. Because I think one thing that's wonderful about the industry that we're a part of is there's a tremendous amount of diversity, and we see, very, very enthusiastic pockets of builders and customers all over the world, not just in sort of the usual suspects of wealthiest, most sort of highest GDP countries, but actually we see some of our most excited users in places that for the game industry have not traditionally been major sources of revenue. There was a great list that came out the other day talking about the highlights of places like Turkey and Argentina and the Philippines and Thailand. And, Web3 is really a technology that will unite disparate communities around the world. So I think this is fantastic. So with that, I would like to wrap up my presentation for today. but remind you that we do have a panel coming on in about half an hour together with my colleagues from the Open Metaverse Alliance. So we're going to chat more about interoperability in the metaverse and about how we create standards and work together as a community to do so. So I'd encourage you to stay tuned, and thank you very much.